Some truths are written in fire, and some women are condemned for healing what others fear. England, 1823. The autumn wind carried the scent of dying roses through the overgrown gardens of Hartley House, a once proud estate now reduced to crumbling stone and peeling paint. Eleanor Hartley knelt in the herb garden behind the manor, her fingers stained green from harvesting chamomile, her dark brown hair escaping its simple braid to frame a face marked more by determination than vanity. At 26, the daughter of the late Viscount Hartley had long abandoned the silks and satins of her youth in favour of plain wool dresses that could withstand the work of survival. The morning sun revealed the truth her father's title had once concealed. Broken windows patched with oiled cloth, gardens choked with weeds save for the medicinal beds Eleanor tended with fierce devotion. Creditors from London circled like vultures, demanding £140 her father's gambling had stolen from their future. The servants had all departed save for Mrs. Thornbury, the ageing housekeeper who refused to abandon the girl she had helped raise. Eleanor straightened, pressing a hand to the small of her back as she surveyed the neat rows of feverfew, valerian, and yarrow. These plants were her salvation and her secret. What her grandmother had taught her mother, and her mother had taught her, now kept them from complete destitution. The knowledge of which leaves soothed infection, which roots calmed fever, which flowers eased the pains of childbirth. Knowledge that made the local poor seek her out in darkness. Pressing copper coins into her palm in exchange for remedies the physicians charged 10 times as much to provide. "Miss Eleanor," Mrs. Thornbury called from the kitchen door. Her weathered face creased with worry. "Young Mary from Westmere Manor is here. Says it's urgent." Eleanor wiped her hands on her apron and hurried inside. Mary, a slight girl of perhaps 17 with frightened eyes, stood twisting her cap between her fingers. "Please, miss," Mary whispered, glancing over her shoulder as though afraid of being overheard. "It's His Grace. The Duke returned from London yesterday, but there was an accident on the road. The carriage overturned. He's wounded, miss, and the doctors, they cannot stop the infection. He burns with fever, and they say he may not survive the night." Eleanor's breath caught. The Duke of Westmere, Alexander Graves, was the most powerful man in the county, perhaps in all of southern England. His estate bordered what remained of her father's lands, though she had never met him. He spent his time in London, in Parliament. Anywhere but the countryside his ancestors had ruled for generations. "Why come to me?" Eleanor asked, though she already knew the answer. "Surely His Grace has access to the finest physicians." "The finest physicians have failed," Mary said desperately. "But I remember, miss, when my mother took ill with the poisoning from bad meat. The doctors bled her, said she would die. You gave me that tea, told me how to apply the poultices. She lived, miss. She lived because of you." Tears spilled down the girl's cheeks. "Please, I know it's not proper, but I cannot watch him die when there might be something, anything that could help." Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. To enter the Duke's home uninvited, to treat him without the permission of his physicians, could destroy what little reputation she had left. But the girl's desperation reminded her of why she had learned this art in the first place. Not for coin, not for recognition, but because life was precious, and knowledge unused was knowledge wasted. "I will come," she said quietly, "but we must be discreet." So, the ride to Westmere Manor took less than an hour in Mary's small cart, though Eleanor felt every rut in the road. The Duke's estate rose from the landscape like a monument to permanence, all pale stone and perfectly proportioned windows, surrounded by gardens that made Eleanor's heart ache with their manicured beauty. This was wealth beyond imagination, power beyond question. Mary led her through the servants' entrance, up back staircases Eleanor suspected few members of the aristocracy ever glimpsed. The manor was in chaos. Servants whispered in corners. A woman Eleanor recognized as the housekeeper stood outside a door, her face grey with strain. "Mrs. Henley," Mary said softly. "I've brought Miss Hartley. She may be able to help." The housekeeper's eyes widened, then narrowed as she assessed Eleanor's plain dress and work-worn hands. But desperation won over propriety. "The doctors left an hour ago. Mrs. Henley said. Said there was nothing more they could do, that we should prepare for the worst. If you have any skill at all, miss, I beg you to try. His Grace is all we have. The room beyond the door smelled of sickness and the metallic tang of blood. Heavy curtains blocked the afternoon light, leaving the space in shadow. Eleanor's eyes adjusted slowly, revealing the massive bed where Alexander Graves lay motionless beneath sweat-soaked sheets. Even in illness, his presence commanded the room. Dark hair matted to his forehead, strong features drawn tight with pain. The powerful frame of a man who rode and fenced and lived life with vigour, now reduced to helpless fever. Eleanor moved to his side, her fingers finding the pulse at his throat. Too rapid, too weak. She pulled back the bandages the physicians had applied to a wound on his shoulder and bit back a gasp. The gash was deep, already showing the angry red streaks of infection spreading outward. They had stitched it, but had done nothing to draw out the poison festering within. I need clean water, Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the fear curling in her stomach. Boiling water and clean cloth. Bring me honey if you have it, and wine, the strongest you possess. Mary, fetch my bag from the cart. For the next 3 hours, Eleanor worked with the focused intensity her grandmother had drilled into her. She reopened the wound, ignoring the Duke's fevered thrashing as she cleaned away the infected tissue. The smell was terrible, but she had smelled worse in the cottages of the poor. She packed the cleaned wound with a poultice of comfrey and calendula, adding honey for its ability to prevent further infection. She brewed strong tea from willow bark and fever-few, coaxing the unconscious Duke to swallow small sips. As midnight approached, she prepared her most precious remedy: white willow bark for pain and fever, elderflower to induce sweating and break the fever's grip, and a carefully measured amount of poppy tincture to let him rest while his body fought the infection. She had learned the proportions from her grandmother's journal, measurements perfected over decades of healing. Throughout her work, the Duke remained lost in fever dreams. Once, his hand caught hers with surprising strength, his eyes opening but not seeing, not truly conscious. His lips moved, forming words she could not hear. She pressed a cool cloth to his forehead, murmuring the same reassurances she had offered to frightened children and dying elders. You will survive this, she whispered, more prayer than promise. You are strong, and I will not let you go easily. Near dawn, the fever broke. Eleanor felt it in the subtle shift of his breathing, the way the tension left his shoulders. His skin, which had been burning beneath her touch, cooled to something closer to normal. The wound, when she checked it, showed no further spread of infection. He would live. Exhaustion crashed over her like a wave. She had been awake for nearly 24 hours. Her back ached from bending over the bed, and her hands trembled from the careful, precise work. But he would live. Miss Hartley, Mrs. Henley said softly from the doorway. You should rest. We have a room prepared. Eleanor shook her head, suddenly aware of how inappropriate her presence here had become. An unmarried woman, alone in a duke's bedchamber through the night. If anyone beyond these walls knew, the scandal would be complete. I should return home, she said, rising stiffly. Change the poultice every 6 hours. Keep giving him the tea, 1 cup every 4 hours, until the fever is gone completely. Watch for any return of the red streaks. If they appear, send for me immediately. She gathered her supplies, tucking jars and packets back into her worn leather bag. As she did, she became aware of a scent clinging to everything. The lavender and rosemary she had added to the poultices, meant to soothe and heal. It permeated the room now, mixing with the beeswax candles to create something both medicinal and strangely comforting. Mary escorted her back through the silent manor. Dawn was breaking as they emerged into the servants' courtyard, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Eleanor felt the weight of what she had done settling onto her shoulders. She had saved a duke's life, but no one could ever know. Miss Hartley, Mary said as Eleanor climbed into the cart. Thank you. Truly, I will never forget what you've done. Eleanor managed a tired smile. Just remember, Mary, tell no one. His Grace's physicians must take the credit. or we will both suffer for this night's work." The ride back to Hartley House passed in a blur. Eleanor stumbled into the kitchen where Mrs. Thornbury waited, letting the old woman guide her upstairs to her bed. She fell asleep still wearing her stained dress, her hands smelling of herbs and honey, her mind full of blue eyes that had looked at her without seeing, and strong hands that had gripped hers in fevered desperation. She did not know that in 3 months' time those same eyes would watch her burn, but that morning, as she slept the dreamless sleep of exhaustion, she knew only that she had done what her grandmother had taught her. She had saved a life, and surely that could never be counted as sin. 3 months of silence had passed since that desperate night at Westmere Manor. Eleanor heard through village gossip that the Duke had recovered fully, that his physicians had taken credit for the miraculous cure, and that he had returned to London shortly after. She was grateful for the anonymity, though sometimes, late at night, she wondered if he remembered anything of his fevered hours, if any fragment of memory remained of the woman who had sat beside him through the darkest part of the night. The autumn had given way to early winter, and Eleanor's situation had grown more precarious. The creditors had sent their final notice, £140, or they would seize Hartley House and sell it to satisfy the debt. She had saved £73 through her careful work with herbs, but it was not enough. It would never be enough. Still, she continued her quiet ministry to the poor. On a cold December morning, she was grinding dried comfrey root when young Thomas Fletcher appeared at her kitchen door, his face white with terror. "Miss Hartley," he gasped, "it's my son, Peter. He took sick 3 days ago, and now he cannot breathe properly. His chest rattles something terrible, and he burns with fever. Please, I know we haven't the coin to pay a proper physician, but if you have anything at all." Eleanor grabbed her bag without hesitation. She had treated lung infections before, knew the delicate balance required to break the fever without weakening the patient further. The Fletcher farm was a modest holding, neat and well kept despite their poverty. Inside the small cottage, 8-year-old Peter lay on a narrow bed, his breathing laboured and shallow, his lips tinged faintly blue. Eleanor worked quickly, preparing a steam tent using boiling water infused with eucalyptus leaves she had dried that summer. She positioned the boy's head over the steam, covering him with a cloth to trap the vapours. For the fever, she administered willow bark tea, and for the congestion in his lungs, a syrup made from thyme, honey, and horehound. She stayed through the afternoon and into the evening, monitoring his breathing, adjusting the treatments as his body responded. By midnight, Peter Fletcher was sleeping peacefully, his breathing clear, his fever reduced. Eleanor left instructions with his grateful father and walked home through the darkness, her heart light despite her exhaustion. This was why she did this work. For moments like these, when knowledge and care made the difference between life and death. She did not know that Thomas Fletcher, in his joy and relief, would speak too freely at the village tavern the following evening, that his words would reach the wrong ears. Lord Edmund Fairchild, Viscount of Thornbury, was a man drowning in debts of his own making. Gambling had consumed his fortune, bad investments had destroyed what remained, and now creditors far more powerful than Eleanor's circled his modest holdings. His only hope lay in his daughter Caroline, a timid girl of 19 whose gentle beauty might attract a wealthy husband. And the wealthiest, most eligible man in the county had just returned from London. The Duke of Westmere was back at his estate, and Fairchild had heard whispers that Alexander Graves was finally considering marriage. If Caroline could secure him, Fairchild's problems would vanish. A duke's father-in-law would have access to credit, to influence, to salvation. But Fairchild had observed the Duke during his brief time in the county, had seen the way Alexander's gaze occasionally drifted toward the overgrown grounds of Hartley House, the way he made inquiries about the late Viscount's daughter. The man was curious about Eleanor Hartley, and curiosity could become interest, and interest could become courtship. That could not be allowed to happen. When Fairchild heard Thomas Fletcher's story of the miraculous cure, his cunning mind saw opportunity. The common folk spoke of Eleanor Hartley with reverence, called her healing touch a gift from God. But those same words, twisted slightly, could become something far more sinister. Fairchild began his campaign carefully. A word here, a suggestion there. Was it natural for a woman to have such knowledge? How did she achieve cures that trained physicians could not? His wife, Lady Marguerite, proved an eager ally. She visited the vicar's wife, a woman named Catherine Morris, who had lost an infant son 6 months prior, despite Eleanor's desperate attempts to save him. "I know your pain," Lady Marguerite said, her voice dripping false sympathy. "But have you considered that perhaps the child's death was not natural? That perhaps Eleanor Hartley's so-called remedies are not what they seem?" Catherine Morris, still raw with grief, needed little encouragement to transform her sorrow into rage. If Eleanor had truly been skilled, truly been good, would her son not have lived? The seed of doubt, once planted, grew quickly in soil, fertilized by loss. Within a week, the whispers had spread throughout the village of Westmere. Eleanor Hartley was not a healer. She was something far darker. How else could a woman possess such knowledge? How else could she succeed where learned physicians failed? And the recovery of the Fletcher boy, so swift, so complete, was it not unnatural? Against the laws of God and nature, the Duke of Westmere heard the rumours during a meeting with his steward. Alexander Graves listened with growing discomfort as the man spoke of accusations of witchcraft being levelled against a local woman. But when the steward mentioned a remote house called Hartley, nothing more than a name attached to a patch of countryside, Alexander felt no recognition. The night of his fever was a blur of pain and fragmented dreams. He remembered gentle hands, a soothing voice, the scent of lavender and rosemary, but no face, no name to attach to the memory of his salvation. "Surely such accusations are medieval nonsense," Alexander said dismissively. "This is the 19th century, not the Dark Ages." Yet experience had taught him that nonsense could still kill when enough people chose to believe it. "Have one of the riders go to Westmere," he added more quietly, "not to interfere, only to listen. If Lord Fairchild is stoking this fever, I want to know how hot he intends to make it." "Nevertheless, Your Grace," the steward replied carefully, "the vicar has called for an inquiry. The woman is to be questioned tomorrow at the church. Eleanor knew nothing of the gathering storm until the village constable appeared at Hartley House with 2 men bearing the authority of the church. She was in her garden, harvesting the last of the winter herbs when they arrived. "Miss Eleanor Hartley," the constable said, his face troubled. He had known her father, had watched Eleanor grow from child to woman. "I am commanded to escort you to the village for questioning regarding accusations of witchcraft and ungodly practices." The words struck her like a physical blow. Witchcraft. The charge that had burned thousands of women across Europe, that had ended countless lives in flame and terror. She looked at the constable, saw the apology in his eyes, and understood that protesting would serve no purpose. "May I change into more suitable attire?" she asked, her voice remarkably steady. They allowed her this dignity. She dressed in her simplest gown, dark blue wool without ornament. She braided her hair severely and covered it with a plain cap. Mrs. Thornbury wept as Eleanor was led away, but there was nothing the old woman could do. Nothing anyone could do when the church and the aristocracy aligned against you. The questioning took place in the cold stone church of Westmere Village. The vicar, a nervous man named Reverend Thomas Whitmore, sat behind a table with Lord Fairchild beside him. Catherine Morris stood to one side, her face hard with vindictive satisfaction. A crowd had gathered, filling the pews, drawn by the spectacle of a gentlewoman brought low. "Miss Hartley," Reverend Whitmore began, his hands shaking slightly as he shuffled papers before him. "You are accused of practicing witchcraft, of using unnatural means to effect cures that defy the will of God. How do you answer these charges?" Eleanor lifted her chin. "I answer that they are false. I have learned the properties of herbs and plants, knowledge passed down through generations of women in my family. There is nothing unnatural or ungodly about using what God has provided in nature to ease suffering. Yet you succeed where trained physicians fail." Lord Fairchild interjected, his voice smooth and dangerous. "You accomplish what men with years of education cannot. How do you explain this, if not through dark powers?" "I explain it through observation and experience," Eleanor replied. through careful study of which remedies work and which do not. My grandmother treated the poor for 50 years. My mother continued her work. I have simply carried on their legacy." Catherine Morris stepped forward, her voice shaking with emotion. "You treated my son when he took sick. You gave me your teas and your poultices, and you told me he would live. But he died, Miss Hartley. He died in agony. What if your remedies are not meant to heal but to harm? What if you choose who lives and who dies according to some dark compact? Your son had a fever of the brain," Eleanor said gently, though her heart ached for the woman's loss. "I did everything I knew to save him. But some illnesses are beyond any healer's power, whether they be physician or herbalist. I am not God, Mrs. Morris. I cannot command life and death. I can only offer what knowledge I possess and pray it is enough." The questioning continued for hours. Every person Eleanor had ever treated was discussed, every cure examined for signs of the unnatural. The fact that Peter Fletcher had recovered so quickly was presented as evidence of witchcraft rather than skill. The fact that Eleanor possessed knowledge uncommon among women of her class was deemed suspicious rather than admirable. As evening approached, creditors appeared at the church, demanding payment of Eleanor's debts. Lord Fairchild seized upon this new information with evident glee, suggesting that a woman desperate for money might make any bargain, even with the devil himself, to survive. Through it all, Eleanor maintained her composure. She answered each question truthfully, defended her work with quiet dignity, and refused to confess to crimes she had not committed. But she saw the faces in the crowd, saw how suspicion had replaced the gratitude some had once shown her. Fear was a powerful thing, and Lord Fairchild wielded it with expertise. As darkness fell, Reverend Whitmore consulted with Lord Fairchild in hushed tones. Finally he stood, his face grave. "Miss Eleanor Hartley," he announced, his voice carrying through the silent church. "This inquiry has revealed disturbing evidence of unnatural practices and ungodly knowledge. As vicar of this parish, and with the support of Lord Fairchild as Justice of the Peace, I declare you guilty of witchcraft. In 3 days' time, a fire will be built in the village square of Westmere, so that all may witness the fate of those who traffic with darkness." The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs. Eleanor felt the words wash over her, unable to fully comprehend their meaning. Death, by burning, in 3 days. She was taken to a small stone building that served as the village jail, little more than a single room with a barred window. As the heavy door closed behind her, Eleanor sank onto the narrow cot, and finally allowed herself to feel the terror she had held at bay throughout the day. In 3 days, she would burn, and there was no one left in the world who could save her. The 3 days Eleanor spent in that cold stone cell passed with the terrible slowness of a nightmare from which one cannot wake. Mrs. Thornbury came twice, bringing food Eleanor could not eat, and speaking words of comfort that rang hollow against the certainty of what awaited. The old woman wept openly, her gnarled hands gripping Eleanor's through the bars, but there was nothing she could do. A housekeeper had no power against the combined weight of church and aristocracy. On the morning of the 3rd day, Eleanor was taken from the cell and led through streets she had known all her life. The village of Westmere had transformed into something unrecognizable. Hundreds of people lined the narrow lanes. Some she recognized as those she had helped, others strangers drawn by the spectacle of an execution. Their faces blurred together, a sea of curiosity and judgment and fear. The square had been prepared with terrible efficiency. In its center stood a wooden stake driven deep into the ground, surrounded by bundled kindling and larger logs arranged to burn hot and fast. Eleanor's legs nearly gave way at the sight, but the guards on either side held her upright, marching her forward with inexorable purpose. Near the stake, a covered platform had been erected for those of rank to observe. Eleanor saw Lord Fairchild there, his face showing satisfaction barely concealed behind a mask of righteousness. Lady Marguerite sat beside him in crimson silk, as though attending a theatrical performance rather than an execution. And beside her mother sat Caroline Fairchild, the girl for whom this entire tragedy had been orchestrated. But where her parents showed triumph, Caroline's face was pale and troubled, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. Reverend Whitmore stood near the stake, a Bible clutched in his shaking hands. Eleanor wondered if he truly believed she deserved this fate, or if Lord Fairchild's influence had proved stronger than his conscience. Either way, the result would be the same. As Eleanor was led onto the platform, she caught sight of Mary, the young servant from Westmere Manor, standing at the edge of the crowd. The girl's face was streaked with tears, her expression desperate. Their eyes met briefly, and Eleanor saw Mary turn and run, pushing through the crowd with frantic urgency. But it was too late for rescue now. The execution had been decreed, and nothing short of intervention from the highest authority could stop it. The guards bound Eleanor to the stake with rough rope, pulling her arms behind her and securing them tightly. The wood pressed against her spine, solid and unyielding. She could smell the pitch that had been poured over the kindling, designed to make the flames catch quickly. A small mercy, perhaps, if any mercy could be found in burning alive. "Eleanor Hartley," Reverend Whitmore intoned, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent square. "You have been found guilty of witchcraft and ungodly practices. Have you any final words? Will you confess your sins and beg God's forgiveness before you meet your fate?" Eleanor lifted her head, her green eyes sweeping across the assembled crowd. She saw faces she knew, people whose children she had treated, whose wives she had helped through difficult births, whose elderly parents she had eased through their final days. Some had the grace to look ashamed. Most simply stared, caught in the grip of mob mentality that transformed neighbours into executioners. "I have committed no sin," Eleanor said, her voice clear and steady despite the terror threatening to overwhelm her. "I have used the knowledge my grandmother and mother taught me to ease suffering where I could. If caring for the sick and the poor is witchcraft, then I am guilty as charged. But I will not confess to trafficking with darkness when all I have ever done is seek the light of understanding God placed in the natural world." A murmur rippled through the crowd, some moved by her words, others hardened against them. Lord Fairchild stood, his face reddening with anger at Eleanor's refusal to submit. "Light the fire," he commanded. "Let this witch burn, and let all who would follow her path see the consequences of defying God's natural order." 2 men approached with torches, their flames bright in the grey morning light. Eleanor felt her composure finally cracking, felt the scream building in her throat as they touched the torches to the kindling. The pitch-soaked wood caught immediately, flames racing across the base of the pyre with terrifying speed. Heat blossomed against Eleanor's feet and legs. Smoke began to rise, acrid and choking. She closed her eyes, praying for courage, for the end to come quickly, for anything but the agony she knew awaited. The roar of the flames grew louder, mixing with the sound of the crowd, with her own racing heartbeat, with the desperate prayers tumbling from her lips. Then, impossibly, she heard hoofbeats, the thunder of a horse ridden hard, coming closer, closer. The crowd's murmur changed pitch, confusion replacing bloodlust. Eleanor opened her eyes to see the masses parting, people scrambling aside as a massive black horse charged directly toward the pyre. The rider was a man she had never seen conscious, never met in the light of day, but whose face she had studied during long hours beside a fevered sickbed. Alexander Graves, Duke of Westmere, wore no hat, his black hair wild from the ride, his blue eyes blazing with fury and determination. He did not slow as he approached the flames, did not hesitate. He simply drove his horse through the outer edge of the fire, scattering burning wood, and leaped from the saddle directly into the heart of the pyre. The flames had not yet reached their full strength, the wood at the centre still catching, but the heat was intense. Eleanor watched in disbelief as the Duke staggered through smoke and fire, his fine coat smoking, his hands reaching for the ropes that bound her. The hemp was thick and stubborn, resistant to his efforts, but he did not stop. His fingers worked at the knots with desperate speed, and Eleanor saw his skin reddening, blistering from the heat and flames. "Your Grace," she gasped, her voice rough from smoke. "You cannot. You must leave me." "Be silent," he commanded, his voice harsh. But his eyes, those impossibly blue eyes, meeting hers with an intensity that stole her breath more completely than the smoke, I did not survive your care only to watch you burn for the crime of saving my life. The ropes came free. Alexander pulled Eleanor from the stake, shielding her body with his own as he half carried, half dragged her through the flames. They stumbled together out of the fire, both coughing, both marked by smoke and small burns, but alive. Impossibly, miraculously alive. The square had erupted into chaos. The crowd surged forward and pulled back simultaneously, unsure how to react to a duke who had just run into fire to save a condemned witch. Guards stood frozen, hands on their weapons, but making no move to intervene. Lord Fairchild had risen from his seat, his face purple with rage and disbelief. Alexander steadied Eleanor on her feet, then turned to face the assembled masses. His coat was ruined, singed and smoking. His hands were burned, the skin angry red and already beginning to blister. But he stood tall, every inch the Duke, and when he spoke, his voice carried the absolute authority of generations of aristocratic power. "If Eleanor Hartley is a witch," he declared, his words ringing across the silent square, "then I, Alexander Graves, Duke of Westmere, am equally cursed. For I was dying 3 months past, and it was her knowledge, her skill with herbs and healing that saved my life. The same treatments you condemn as witchcraft are the reason I stand before you now. If you burn her, then you must burn me as well, for I have benefited from the same ungodly arts you fear." A shocked gasp rippled through the crowd. Eleanor stared at him, understanding dawning. He had been unconscious, lost in fever, but somehow he had discovered the truth. Somehow he knew. "Your Grace," Reverend Whitmore stammered, his face pale. "Surely you do not understand what you are saying. This woman has been tried and found guilty." "This woman," Alexander interrupted, his voice cold as winter, "has been condemned by a trial that would be laughable if it were not tragic. I am invoking my right as Duke of Westmere and Lord of this county to demand a full investigation into these charges. By law, no execution can proceed over the objection of the ranking noble, and I object with every fibre of my being." Lord Fairchild descended from his platform, his expression desperate. "Your Grace, you cannot possibly. The evidence against her is overwhelming." "The evidence," Alexander said, his eyes narrowing, "will be examined by impartial observers, not by men with their own interests to protect." His gaze locked with Fairchild's, and something passed between them, some recognition of the game being played. "I wonder, Fairchild, what investigation might reveal about who truly benefits from Miss Hartley's conviction." The threat in his voice was unmistakable. Fairchild took a step backward, his confidence crumbling. Alexander turned to the guards, who had bound Eleanor to the stake. "You will escort Miss Hartley to Westmere Manor, where she will remain under my protection until this matter is properly resolved. Anyone who interferes will answer to me personally." Eleanor felt dizzy, the smoke and shock and sudden reversal leaving her unable to fully process what was happening. She became aware of the Duke's hand on her elbow, steady and sure, as he guided her toward his horse. The crowd parted before them like water, no one willing to challenge the Duke's authority. As Alexander lifted Eleanor onto his horse, she caught sight of Mary at the edge of the square, the young servant's face wet with relieved tears. Mary had run to the manor, had told the Duke the truth, had saved Eleanor's life with her courage and loyalty. Alexander mounted behind Eleanor, his arms coming around her to grip the reins, and she felt surrounded by his presence, protected by his body and his rank, and his inexplicable willingness to risk everything for a woman he barely knew. As the horse began to move, carrying them away from the pyre that still smoked in the centre of the square, Eleanor allowed herself to lean back against his chest, exhaustion and delayed terror finally overwhelming her composure. "Why?" she whispered, the word almost lost in the sound of hoofbeats and the murmuring crowd. Alexander's voice was low, meant only for her ears. "Because some debts can only be repaid in kind. You gave me my life. The least I can do is return the favour." He paused, and she felt him looking down at her, felt the weight of his gaze. "And because I remember, Miss Hartley, not your face, not your name, but I remember the scent of lavender and rosemary, the gentle hands that would not let me go. I remember your voice, telling me I would survive. When Mary told me this morning that the woman they were burning was you, that the healer condemned for witchcraft was the same woman who saved my life, I knew I could not stand idle. Eleanor closed her eyes, tears she had held back throughout her ordeal, finally spilling free. Behind them, the square of Westmere slowly returned to normalcy, the crowds dispersing, the fire dying to embers. But nothing would be the same. A duke had stepped into flames for a condemned woman, and that single act had changed everything. Westmere Manor received Eleanor like a sanctuary receiving a refugee from war. The Duke's personal physician, Dr. William Bentley, a distinguished man recently arrived from London, met them in the entrance hall with grave concern etched across his features. Alexander dismounted first, then carefully lifted Eleanor down, her legs unsteady beneath her as the shock of the morning's events fully settled into her bones. Dr. Bentley, Alexander said, his voice tight with controlled emotion, Miss Hartley requires immediate care. She has suffered smoke inhalation and burns from the fire. See that she is given the best room in the East Wing and whatever treatment she requires. Of course, Your Grace, Doctor, Bentley replied, his sharp eyes taking in Eleanor's soot-stained face and the angry red marks on her wrists where the ropes had bitten into her skin. Miss Hartley, if you will permit me to examine you. Eleanor nodded mutely, still processing the impossible reversal of her fate. An hour ago, she had been moments from death. Now, she stood in the grandest manor in the county, being offered care by a London physician. The contrast was too great, her mind struggling to bridge the gap between horror and salvation. Mrs. Henley, the housekeeper Eleanor remembered from that desperate night 3 months ago, appeared with clean linens and a basin of warm water. The woman's eyes widened with recognition and something that might have been guilt as she curtsied to Eleanor. Miss Hartley, Mrs. Henley said softly, I am glad to see you alive. Mary told us what happened this morning. It is a blessing His Grace arrived in time. Eleanor was led upstairs to a guest chamber that put her entire home to shame. Pale blue walls, elegant furniture, windows overlooking manicured gardens that seemed to stretch forever. She stood in the center of the room, her burned and dirty dress incongruous against such refinement, and felt tears threatening again. Dr. Bentley's examination was thorough but gentle. The burns on her feet and legs were superficial, the flames having not had time to do their worst work before Alexander pulled her free. He applied salves and clean bandages, prescribed rest and nourishment, and departed with instructions that she was not to be disturbed except for meals and necessary care. A maid arrived with hot water and helped Eleanor bathe, washing away the smoke and terror of the morning. Fresh clothes were provided, simple but well made, belonging to Alexander's late mother, and stored away these many years. Eleanor dressed mechanically, her mind still struggling to accept her continued existence. That evening, Alexander sent word that he wished to see her in his study. Eleanor descended the grand staircase with trepidation, uncertain what this interview would entail. She had thanked him already, stammered words of gratitude in the courtyard, but that seemed insufficient for a man who had literally walked through fire for her. The study was a masculine room, all dark wood and leather, shelves lined with books and papers speaking to a mind that valued knowledge and order. Alexander stood by the window, staring out at the darkening gardens, his hands bandaged from his burns. He turned as she entered, and Eleanor saw exhaustion in his face, the toll the day had taken visible in the tight lines around his eyes. Miss Hartley, he said, gesturing to a chair near the fire. Please, sit. We have much to discuss. Eleanor settled into the offered seat, her hands folded in her lap to keep them from trembling. Alexander poured 2 glasses of brandy, pressing one into her hands despite her weak protest. Drink, he commanded gently. For the shock, if nothing else. The brandy burned pleasantly, spreading warmth through Eleanor's chest. Alexander took the chair opposite hers, wincing slightly as his burned hands gripped the glass. I have spent this afternoon gathering information, he began without preamble. Mary's revelation this morning was the first I knew of your identity, but it was far from the last thing I learned. I have interviewed everyone in my household who had contact with you the night you saved my life. I have reviewed the charges brought against you by Reverend Whitmore and Lord Fairchild, and I have reached certain conclusions that trouble me greatly." Eleanor waited, her heart pounding, uncertain where this was leading. "Tell me about your grandmother," Alexander said, leaning forward. "Mary mentioned she was a healer as well. How did this knowledge come to you?" Eleanor took another sip of brandy, gathering her thoughts. "My grandmother was the daughter of an apothecary in Bristol. She learned about herbs and remedies from childhood, studying her father's work. When she married my grandfather, she brought that knowledge with her. She spent 50 years treating the poor who could not afford physicians, documenting what worked and what did not. My mother learned from her, and I learned from my mother. It is simply knowledge, Your Grace. Observation and experience passed from one generation to the next. Yet men with university educations dismiss such knowledge as superstition or worse," Alexander said, a note of anger entering his voice. "I was dying, Miss Hartley. I felt death approaching, and my expensive London physicians could do nothing but bleed me and offer prayers. You, with your herbs and your grandmother's wisdom, saved my life where they failed, and for this you were to burn. Many fear what they do not understand," Eleanor said quietly. "Women who heal without formal training are threatening to those who profit from illness. And when a woman possesses knowledge that men do not, it becomes dangerous rather than valuable." Alexander studied her intently. "This morning, when I rode into that square and saw you bound to the stake, I felt something I have not experienced in years. Pure, absolute rage. Not at you, but at the injustice of it, at the waste of it. That a woman of evident skill and compassion should be condemned, while those who manipulated the trial for their own benefit stood witness as though performing a holy duty." "You believe Lord Fairchild orchestrated my arrest?" Eleanor asked, though she had suspected as much herself. "I am certain of it," Alexander replied grimly. "This afternoon, I had my solicitor conduct quiet inquiries into Fairchild's finances. The man is drowning in debt, Miss Hartley. Gambling debts, primarily, totaling over £2,000. His only hope of salvation lies in marrying his daughter to a man of substantial means." He paused, his blue eyes meeting hers. A man such as myself, understanding dawned. He saw me as a threat, as competition for your attention. You, specifically, yes. After my recovery, I made inquiries about the healer who had saved me. Your name was mentioned, and I asked my steward for information about you. Fairchild would have heard of my interest through the usual channels of gossip that plague small communities. He needed you removed before any attachment could form. Eleanor felt sick, but I never sought your attention. I wanted only to remain anonymous, to continue my work quietly, which is precisely what makes his actions so reprehensible, Alexander said, his voice hardening. You were an innocent obstacle to his schemes, and he had no compunction about destroying you to achieve his goals. He set down his glass and leaned forward. This afternoon, I also made discoveries about your own situation, the debts your father left behind, the creditors circling Hartley House. £140, I understand. Eleanor flushed with shame. I do not seek charity, Your Grace. This is not charity, Alexander said firmly. It is recompense and protection. While you remain under investigation for witchcraft, you are vulnerable in ways that extend far beyond the original charges. Creditors could seize your property, leaving you destitute and unable to defend yourself. I have instructed my solicitor to pay your debts in full. The transaction will be documented as legal compensation for services rendered, specifically for saving my life. Your Grace, I cannot possibly accept such generosity, Eleanor protested, even as hope bloomed treacherously in her chest. The debt is too large, the obligation too great. The obligation is mine, not yours, Alexander countered. My life is worth considerably more than £140, Miss Hartley. Consider the debt paid and trouble yourself no further about it. Eleanor felt tears pricking at her eyes. The weight she had carried for 3 years, the crushing burden of her father's mistakes, lifted in an instant by this man's decree. It seemed impossible, too generous to be real. There is more we must discuss, Alexander continued, his expression softening slightly. The investigation into the charges against you will take time. I have sent word to the bishop in London, requesting an official ecclesiastical inquiry separate from Reverend Whitmore's local authority. I have also contacted colleagues in Parliament who specialise in legal reform. They will ensure this matter is handled properly, not by men with personal interests at stake. How long will this take? Eleanor asked. Weeks, perhaps longer. During that time, you will remain here at Westmere Manor as my guest and under my protection. Anyone who attempts to harm you will answer directly to me. His voice carried absolute certainty, the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Over the following 2 weeks, Eleanor slowly adjusted to her new circumstances. The shock of nearly burning alive faded to nightmares that woke her gasping in the dark. Mrs. Henley appearing with soothing tea and quiet reassurance. During the days, she walked the manor's gardens, gradually regaining her strength and equilibrium. Alexander spent much of his time conducting his investigation, interviewing witnesses and gathering evidence. But in the evenings, he often invited Eleanor to dine with him, and afterward they would retire to the library where conversations ranging from literature to philosophy to the properties of various medicinal plants stretched late into the night. Eleanor found herself drawn to him in ways she had not anticipated. Not merely gratitude for her salvation, though that ran deep, but genuine admiration for his intellect and character. He listened when she spoke, asked thoughtful questions, treated her knowledge with respect rather than dismissal. And there were moments when their eyes would meet across the dinner table, or beside the library fire, when something electric would pass between them, unspoken but undeniable. One evening, 2 weeks after her rescue, Alexander entered the library carrying a small leather journal. Eleanor recognized it immediately as her grandmother's diary of remedies, the one she kept at Hartley House. "Where did you get that?" she asked, rising from her chair in alarm. "I sent Mrs. Thornbury a message asking her to gather your personal belongings and medical supplies," Alexander explained. "I hope you do not mind the intrusion, but I wish to understand more fully the extent of your knowledge." He opened the journal, revealing pages covered in careful handwriting, drawings of plants, detailed notes about dosages and applications. "This is remarkable, Eleanor. Decades of careful observation and documentation. This is not witchcraft. This is science." It was the first time he had used her given name, and the intimacy of it sent warmth through her chest. "My grandmother believed that healing was both art and discipline, that God provided the remedies in nature, but it was our responsibility to study them carefully, to understand how and why they worked." "She was a woman ahead of her time," Alexander said, settling into the chair beside Eleanor's. "I consulted with Dr. Bentley about several of your grandmother's remedies. He confirmed that many align with the latest medical research from European universities. The willow bark tea you used to break my fever, for instance. Researchers in France have isolated the active compound and found it remarkably effective against pain and inflammation." Eleanor leaned closer, drawn by his enthusiasm. "Truly, I knew it worked, but to have it confirmed by formal research. Your grandmother's empirical observations match conclusions reached by men with access to laboratories and scholarly resources," Alexander continued. "The difference is that she reached those conclusions through patient trial and careful notation, while they reached them through academic study. Both paths led to the same truth." Their faces were close now, near enough that Eleanor could see flecks of darker blue in Alexander's eyes, could feel the warmth radiating from his body. The air between them seemed charged with possibility, with attraction neither had fully acknowledged until this moment. "Eleanor," Alexander said softly, his hand reaching up to brush a strand of hair from her face. "I need to tell you something. When I rode into that square this morning and saw you bound to that stake, I was not thinking only of debt or obligation. I was thinking that I could not bear to lose you, not when I had just found you." Before Eleanor could respond, a sharp knock interrupted the moment. Alexander pulled back, frustration flickering across his features as he called permission to enter. A footman appeared, his expression apologetic. "Forgive the intrusion, Your Grace, but a letter has arrived from London. The messenger said it was urgent." Alexander took the letter, breaking the seal with quick efficiency. As he read, his expression darkened considerably. When he finished, he looked up at Eleanor with barely contained fury. "It seems Lady Marguerite Fairchild has written to the bishop, accusing me of harbouring a witch and suggesting that I am myself under some form of enchantment." His voice was cold with rage. "She claims you have used your dark arts to bewitch me, to cloud my judgment and turn me against righteous men like her husband." Eleanor felt her blood run cold. "She seeks to make you a victim as well, to discredit any defence you might mount on my behalf. She miscalculates badly if she believes such accusations will sway me," Alexander said, crushing the letter in his fist. "But it does complicate matters. If Fairchild is desperate enough to attack my credibility directly, he may attempt more direct action against you." That night, as Eleanor lay in bed unable to sleep, she made a decision. Alexander had risked everything for her, his reputation, his standing, perhaps even his safety. She could not allow him to suffer further on her account. By morning, she would be gone, vanished into the anonymity of London, or perhaps passage to the continent. It was the only way to protect him from the consequences of his own nobility. But as she rose before dawn to gather her few belongings, she found Alexander waiting in the corridor outside her room, fully dressed, despite the early hour. "Going somewhere?" he asked quietly, his expression unreadable. Eleanor froze, caught. "I cannot stay, Your Grace. Lady Marguerite's letter made that clear. My presence endangers you. So you planned to leave without a word, to disappear and let me wonder if you had been taken, if harm had come to you." His voice was soft, but anger simmered beneath the surface. "I planned to leave you free to resume your life without the taint of association with me," Eleanor countered. "You have done enough, sacrificed enough. I will not be the instrument of your destruction." Alexander closed the distance between them in 2 strides, his hands gripping her shoulders. "You do not get to make that choice for me, Eleanor. You do not get to decide that protecting me requires leaving when leaving would destroy me more surely than any scandal. You barely know me," she protested weakly. "I know enough," he said fiercely. "I know you are brave and skilled and selfless to the point of foolishness. I know that in 2 weeks you have become more important to me than anyone has been since my brother died. And I know that I will not let you face this alone." His hands gentled on her shoulders, his voice softening. "Stay, Eleanor. Let me fight for you. Let me prove that some men still value justice over expediency, truth over convenient lies." Eleanor looked up into his face, saw the determination and something deeper, something that made her breath catch and her heart race. Slowly, she nodded. "I will stay," she whispered. "But Alexander, if this destroys you, then we will face that destruction together," he said simply. "But I do not intend to be destroyed. I intend to win." The morning after Eleanor discovered her debts had been paid, she found Alexander in his study, surrounded by papers and correspondence. He looked up as she entered, his expression softening from the stern concentration it had held moments before. "I owe you more gratitude than I expressed last night," Eleanor said, standing in the doorway. "The burden you lifted was more than financial. It was the weight of failure, of being unable to protect what my father left behind, however little that was." Alexander rose, moving around the desk to stand before her. "The debt is settled and forgotten. What concerns me now is ensuring your future is secure, not merely from creditors, but from those who would see you harmed for political advantage." He gestured to the papers on his desk. "I have been preparing for the assemblage. It will take place 3 days hence, here at Westmere Manor. I have sent invitations to every family of consequence in the county, including the Fairchilds." "You are giving them a public forum," Eleanor observed. "Is that wise?" "I am giving them enough rope to hang themselves," Alexander corrected. "Fairchild's accusations rely on fear and superstition thriving in darkness. Brought into the light of scrutiny, before witnesses who cannot be intimidated or bribed, they will crumble." Over the next 3 days, Westmere Manor buzzed with preparation. The grand ballroom was transformed into something resembling a courtroom, with chairs arranged in rows facing a raised platform where Alexander would preside. Servants polished silver and crystal, prepared guest chambers for those travelling from distant estates. and whispered among themselves about the unprecedented nature of what was to come. Dr. Bentley arrived from London, bringing with him another physician, Dr. James Crawford, a specialist in medicinal plants from the University of Edinburgh. Eleanor spent an afternoon with both men, demonstrating her remedies and explaining her grandmother's methodologies. Dr. Crawford examined her grandmother's journal with evident fascination, making notes and asking questions that revealed his own extensive knowledge. "Miss Hartley," he said finally, "what you possess here is invaluable. This journal represents decades of empirical research that parallels work being done in universities across Europe. Your grandmother was, in the truest sense, a scientist, though she would never have claimed that title." "She claimed only to be a healer," Eleanor replied. "The title mattered less than the result. A philosophy more physicians should adopt," Dr. Crawford said with a slight smile. "I would be honoured to present testimony on your behalf at the assemblage. The charges against you are not merely unjust. They are an affront to medical progress itself." The evening before the assemblage, Alexander found Eleanor in the library, staring into the fire. She had been reading, but the book lay forgotten in her lap, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. "Are you frightened?" he asked, settling into the chair beside hers. "Terrified," Eleanor admitted. "What if they do not believe the evidence? What if Fairchild's influence proves stronger than truth?" Alexander reached across the space between them, taking her hand in his. His burns had healed well under Dr. Bentley's care, leaving only faint marks on his palms. "Then we will face whatever comes together. But Eleanor, I need you to understand something. This assemblage is not merely about clearing your name, though that is its primary purpose. It is also about establishing precedent, about proving that accusations of witchcraft in this modern age are tools of oppression, not justice." "You are risking much for a principle," Eleanor observed. "I am risking much for you," Alexander corrected. "The principle simply provides additional justification." His thumb traced circles on the back of her hand, the gesture unconscious and intimate. "When this is over, when you are free of these charges and restored to your rightful place in society, I intend to court you properly. With your permission, of course." Eleanor's breath caught. "Alexander, you are a duke. I am the impoverished daughter of a viscount who died in debt and disgrace. Society will never accept such a match. Society will accept what I tell them to accept," Alexander said with quiet confidence. "And if they do not, then society can go to the devil. I have spent too many years living according to others' expectations, Eleanor. My brother's death taught me that life is too short and too precious to waste on pretense. I know my own heart. The question is, do you know yours?" Before Eleanor could answer, before she could voice the feelings that had been growing within her since the moment he pulled her from the flames, a commotion in the entrance hall interrupted them. Raised voices, the sound of someone demanding entry. And then Alexander's butler appeared in the doorway, his usually impassive face showing clear distress. "Your Grace, forgive the intrusion, but Lord Fairchild and Lady Marguerite have arrived unannounced. They insist on speaking with you immediately." They have brought their daughter with them." Alexander's expression hardened. "Show them to the morning room. Tell them I will join them shortly." After the butler departed, he turned to Eleanor. "Stay here. Whatever they have come to say, I do not want you subjected to their poison." "I should be present," Eleanor protested. "If they are making accusations, I have the right to hear them." "You have the right to be protected," Alexander countered, "which is precisely what I intend to do." He departed before Eleanor could argue further, leaving her alone with her racing thoughts and growing dread. Whatever had driven the Fairchilds to arrive the night before, the assemblage could not bode well. In the morning room, Alexander found Lord Fairchild pacing like a caged animal, while Lady Marguerite sat rigidly on the settee. Caroline Fairchild stood by the window, her face pale and her hands trembling. The girl looked as though she wished to be anywhere but present. "Fairchild," Alexander said coldly, not bothering with the usual courtesies. "To what do I owe this unexpected visit?" "Your Grace," Fairchild began, his voice carrying a desperate edge, "I have come to offer a compromise, a way to resolve this unfortunate situation that benefits us all." "I am listening," Alexander said. though his tone suggested he had little interest in anything Fairchild might propose. "Drop the investigation into the charges against Miss Hartley," Fairchild said bluntly. "Accept that the trial was conducted properly and that the original verdict should stand. In exchange, I will withdraw my daughter's name from consideration as your potential bride and recommend to my creditors that they extend my loans." The audacity of the proposal left Alexander momentarily speechless. "You are suggesting I allow an innocent woman to be executed in exchange for your financial convenience?" "I am suggesting that you consider your own position," Fairchild countered, his face reddening. "The bishop has received Lady Marguerite's letter. Questions are being raised about your judgment, about whether you have been compromised by this woman's influence. If you persist in championing her cause, your own reputation will suffer irreparable harm." "My reputation can withstand considerably more than you imagine," Alexander said quietly, dangerously. "What it cannot withstand is the knowledge that I stood by while injustice was done. Miss Hartley saved my life, Fairchild. She used knowledge and skill passed down through generations of women healers, and for this you accused her of witchcraft. Not because you believed it, but because you saw her as an obstacle to your schemes." "You have no proof of such accusations," Lady Marguerite interjected, her voice sharp. "Do I not?" Alexander smiled without humour. "I have testimony from Reverend Whitmore, obtained under the threat of charges for corruption of ecclesiastical office, that you paid him £200 to expedite the trial and ensure a guilty verdict. I have statements from witnesses who heard you spreading rumours about Miss Hartley in the weeks before her arrest. I have financial records showing your husband owes over £2,000 to various creditors, providing clear motivation for desperate action." The colour drained from Fairchild's face. "That information was obtained illegally. It cannot be used." "It can and will be presented tomorrow at the assemblage," Alexander said, "along with expert testimony from 2 respected physicians who will explain that Miss Hartley's remedies are based on sound medical principles, not dark magic, along with statements from every person she has treated successfully over the past 3 years, along with the testimony of my own household, who witnessed her saving my life when trained physicians had given up hope. Father," Caroline Fairchild spoke for the first time, her voice soft but clear, "please stop this. I never wanted any part of this scheme. I never wanted to marry the Duke or anyone else through such methods. Be silent, Caroline," her mother hissed. "This does not concern you." "It concerns me directly," Caroline replied, surprising everyone with her sudden backbone. "You have used me as justification for destroying an innocent woman. You have risked her life and the Duke's reputation for my supposed benefit when I never asked for such sacrifice." She turned to Alexander, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Your Grace, I must tell you something. Something I should have revealed weeks ago." "Caroline, do not dare," her father warned, but the girl ignored him. "I knew about the plan to accuse Miss Hartley," Caroline said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I overheard my parents discussing it a week before her arrest. I knew they intended to manufacture evidence, to bribe Reverend Whitmore, to ensure she was convicted. I did nothing to stop it because I was frightened and confused, and I did not fully understand what they meant to do until it was too late." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "I am so deeply sorry. I should have warned someone, should have found the courage to speak truth. Instead, I remained silent, and Miss Hartley nearly died because of my cowardice." The room fell into stunned silence. Lady Marguerite looked as though she might faint, while Lord Fairchild's expression cycled through fury, fear, and resignation. "You foolish girl," he said finally, his voice hollow. "You have destroyed us all." "No," Alexander said quietly. "You destroyed yourselves the moment you decided an innocent woman's life was worth less than your financial security." He turned to Caroline, his expression softening. "Miss Fairchild, your confession took courage. I will ensure it is presented properly at tomorrow's assemblage." "What happens to us now?" Fairchild asked, all bluster gone, replaced by the defeated tone of a man facing ruin. "That will be decided tomorrow," Alexander replied. "You will attend the assemblage, you will answer questions honestly, and you will accept whatever judgment is rendered. Guards will escort you to guest chambers where you will remain until morning. Any attempt to flee will result in immediate arrest and prosecution. After the Fairchilds were led away, Alexander returned to the library to find Eleanor exactly where he had left her, though she now stood rather than sat, clearly having been unable to remain still during his absence. "What happened?" she asked immediately. Alexander told her everything, watching her face cycle through disbelief, anger, and finally, surprisingly, pity. "That poor girl," Eleanor said softly, "to be caught between loyalty to her parents and knowledge of their wrongdoing. That is a burden no child should bear. Her confession will be crucial tomorrow," Alexander said. "It provides direct evidence of the conspiracy against you, from someone within the Fairchild household itself, and yet I cannot help but feel sorry for her," Eleanor admitted. "She is as much a victim of her parents' ambition as I am." Alexander crossed the room to stand before Eleanor, his hands framing her face with infinite gentleness. "Your capacity for compassion, even toward those who harmed you, is one of the many reasons I am falling in love with you." Eleanor's breath caught, her green eyes widening. "Alexander, I know this is neither the time nor the place for such declarations," he continued. "Tomorrow we face the assemblage, and your freedom hangs in the balance. But I needed you to know, whatever happens, whatever is decided, my feelings are certain. I love you, Eleanor Hartley. I love your strength and your knowledge and your refusal to compromise your principles even when faced with death. I love who you are and who you inspire me to be." Eleanor reached up, her hands covering his, where they still cradled her face. "I love you too," she whispered. "I have been fighting against it, telling myself it was gratitude or shock or anything but love. But it is love, Alexander. Impossible, impractical, entirely inconvenient love." He smiled, that rare, genuine smile that transformed his usually serious face. "The best love usually is." The morning of the assemblage dawned clear and cold. By 10 o'clock, the great ballroom of Westmere Manor was filled with every family of consequence within 50 miles. Earls and viscounts, baronets and country squires, their wives and adult children, all drawn by curiosity and the unprecedented nature of a duke calling such a gathering. Alexander took his place on the raised platform. Eleanor seated to his right, Dr. Bentley and Dr. Crawford to his left. Reverend Whitmore sat in the front row, his face ashen, flanked by church officials sent from London to observe. The Fairchilds occupied seats in the second row, Lord Edmund's face set in grim resignation, Lady Marguerite's expression one of barely contained fury, and Caroline's showing quiet resolve. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alexander began, his voice carrying clearly through the assembled crowd. "Thank you for attending this assemblage. We are gathered to address charges of witchcraft brought against Miss Eleanor Hartley. Charges I believe to be not only false, but maliciously fabricated. Over the next hours, you will hear testimony and see evidence that I trust will convince you of Miss Hartley's innocence and of the corruption that led to her condemnation." For the next 3 hours, the assemblage heard witness after witness. Farmers whose children Eleanor had treated successfully, women whose difficult births she had attended, elderly members of the community whose final years she had eased with her remedies. Dr. Crawford presented detailed analysis of Eleanor's grandmother's journal, explaining how her methods aligned with cutting-edge medical research. Dr. Bentley described the night Eleanor saved the Duke's life, praising her skill and quick thinking. Then came Caroline Fairchild's turn. The girl stood with visible trembling, but her voice remained steady as she described overhearing her parents' plot, the bribery of Reverend Whitmore, the deliberate manufacturing of evidence against Eleanor. By the time she finished, the crowd's murmurs had turned distinctly hostile toward her parents. Not all of the witnesses who rose that morning wore fine cloth or carried titles. Thomas Fletcher, face drawn, cap twisting between work-worn hands, stepped forward at the Duke's summons and spoke of fear rather than sorcery. His boy, Peter, had been sick. He had been desperate. And when Lady Marguerite offered coin and whispered that Miss Hartley had bewitched the child with her strange remedies, he had repeated the tale because it was easier than admitting he did not know how to save his son. His voice broke when he confessed that Eleanor's poultice and patience had helped Peter more than any tonic his neighbours could afford. Catherine Morris followed, her cheeks blotched with shame. She admitted that Lady Marguerite had taken her grief and shaped it into a weapon, coaching her to turn a mother's loss into proof of sin, urging her to swear to things she had only suspected and to repeat rumours as if they were memory. She confessed too that she had stood silent while evidence was produced and interpreted, allowing the vicar to dress ordinary herbs and household objects in ominous language because it was easier in her pain to blame a woman than to accept a cruel illness. Reverend Whitmore, when called to testify, confirmed everything Caroline had said. The £200 from Lady Marguerite, the pressure to expedite the trial, the coaching of witnesses to present their testimony in the most damning light possible. His shame was palpable, his voice breaking as he begged Eleanor's forgiveness. Finally, Alexander called Lord Fairchild himself to testify. The man stood on the platform, looking years older than he had weeks before, and made no attempt to deny the charges. "Everything said here today is true," he admitted, his voice flat. "I orchestrated Miss Hartley's arrest and trial because I believed she posed a threat to my plans to marry my daughter to the Duke. I bribed the Reverend, spread rumours, and manipulated witnesses. I did all of this knowing she was innocent, knowing I was condemning an innocent woman to death because I valued my own financial survival above her life." The crowd erupted in angry voices. Alexander called for order, waiting until silence returned before speaking. "Lord Fairchild, Lady Marguerite, you have confessed to conspiracy, bribery, and attempted murder through false accusation. Miss Eleanor Hartley is hereby declared innocent of all charges. The original verdict is nullified, and she is restored to full standing in society." He paused, his gaze sweeping the assembled crowd. "As for the Fairchilds, I leave their fate to the judgment of this assemblage. What say you?" The response was unanimous and swift. The Fairchilds would be socially expelled from the county, their property sold to satisfy debts, their names struck from every guest list and invitation. Caroline, whose confession had provided crucial evidence, would be spared this fate and allowed to go live with her maternal aunt in Yorkshire, free from the shadow of her parents' crimes. As the assemblage concluded and guests began to depart, many approached Eleanor with apologies and expressions of support. She received them graciously, aware that some of the same faces now offering friendship had watched silently as she was prepared for burning. But she also understood that fear made cowards of good people, and that forgiveness was necessary for healing. That evening, after the last guest had departed and Westmere Manor had returned to quiet, Alexander found Eleanor in the garden, where she had first been allowed to walk after her rescue. Winter had touched the plants, leaving them brown and dormant, but spring would come again, bringing new life. "It is over," he said, coming to stand beside her. "Truly over. You are free, Eleanor. Free to return to Hartley House, to resume your work, to live without fear." "Free," Eleanor repeated, testing the word. "It seems impossible after everything. And yet here we stand," Alexander said, taking her hand. "I meant what I said last night, Eleanor, about courting you properly. If you will permit me." Eleanor turned to face him fully, her green eyes bright in the gathering darkness. "I will permit it on one condition." "Name it, that you allow me to continue my work," she said firmly. "I cannot be merely a decoration, Alexander, no matter how gilded the cage. The knowledge I possess, the ability to help people, that is as much a part of me as breathing. I will not abandon it, not even for love." Alexander smiled, that beautiful, transforming smile. "I would never ask you to. In fact, I was hoping you might establish a proper training program here at Westmere, to teach other women your skills, to document your knowledge, to transform what has been dismissed as superstition into recognized medical practice. As my Duchess, you would have the resources and the protection to do more good than you ever could alone." "As your Duchess," Eleanor whispered, her heart soaring. "Alexander, are you proposing?" "Not yet," he replied. "First comes courtship, as is proper and right. But yes, Eleanor Hartley, when sufficient time has passed and society has had opportunity to see us together, I fully intend to make you my Duchess, if you will have me." "I will," Eleanor said, rising on her toes to press a soft kiss to his lips. "I absolutely will." The 3 months that followed the assemblage passed like a dream Eleanor feared might dissolve upon waking. True to his word, Alexander courted her with a propriety that would satisfy even the most rigid observers of social convention. He called at Hartley House twice weekly, arriving in his fine carriage with flowers from Westmere's greenhouses and books he thought she might enjoy. They walked the grounds of her estate, discussing everything from medical treatises to poetry, chaperoned by Mrs. Thornbury, who observed their growing affection with satisfied approval. But Alexander's courtship extended beyond mere social niceties. Within a week of the assemblage, a team of workers arrived at Hartley House with materials to repair the roof, replace broken windows, and restore the gardens to something approaching their former glory. When Eleanor protested the expense, Alexander simply said that he could not in good conscience court a woman while she lived in conditions unworthy of her station. Besides, he added with that small smile that never failed to make her heart race, I am merely ensuring my future home is properly maintained. The assumption that she would accept his eventual proposal, delivered with such casual confidence, should have irritated Eleanor. Instead, it warmed her to her core. More significantly, Alexander provided Eleanor with resources to establish what he called the Hartley Institute of Medicinal Studies. A small building on the grounds of Hartley House was converted into a combination classroom and laboratory where Eleanor could teach other women her craft. Dr. Crawford travelled from Edinburgh twice monthly to provide formal instruction in anatomy and physiology, lending academic credibility to Eleanor's empirical knowledge. Mary, the woman who had run through Westmere at dawn to raise the alarm and had refused to let Eleanor be forgotten as the crowd gathered, came to Hartley House soon after. She did not ask for reward, only for work that mattered. Eleanor gave it to her gladly, organising supplies, tending the small still room where tinctures were stored, and keeping watch over the women who arrived to learn when their nerves were as frayed as their hope. In a world that had tried to reduce healing to heresy, Mary became one more quiet proof that courage could be practical. The first students were 5 women from the surrounding villages, ranging in age from 19 to 43. They came with varying levels of literacy and education, but all shared a desire to learn healing arts that might support their families or serve their communities. Eleanor taught them as her grandmother had taught her, through demonstration and practice, through understanding not just what worked, but why. The body seeks to heal itself, she explained one afternoon, demonstrating the preparation of a poultice for infection. Our task is not to force healing, but to provide the conditions under which the body's natural processes can succeed. This comfrey root promotes the growth of new tissue. The honey prevents further infection. The lavender soothes inflammation. Together, they create an environment where healing becomes possible. One of her students, a young widow named Margaret, asked, "But Miss Hartley, how do we know which herb does what? There are so many plants, so many possible uses." Eleanor smiled, thinking of her grandmother's journal. Through careful observation and documentation, we try a remedy, note its effects, adjust the preparation if needed, and try again. Science, at its core, is simply organized curiosity. What we are doing here is no different from what physicians do in universities. We simply lack their Latin names and academic credentials. As spring advanced toward summer, Eleanor watched with satisfaction as her students gained confidence and competence. The institute became known throughout the county, and demand for her students' services grew steadily. What had once been condemned as witchcraft was now recognized as valuable medical knowledge, vindicated by Eleanor's public exoneration and Alexander's prestigious support. During this time, Eleanor also observed Alexander facing his own challenges. Several distant relatives expressed disapproval of his courtship, arguing that the daughter of a debt-ridden viscount was beneath his station. Alexander's response was to host a grand dinner at Westmere Manor where he introduced Eleanor to every member of his family, making abundantly clear that his choice was final and not subject to their approval. His grandmother, the Dowager Duchess, proved an unexpected ally. The elderly woman, whom Eleanor had feared meeting, took one look at her and declared, "Finally, Alexander has found a woman with a spine and a brain. About time." But not all opposition came from family. Some members of society, particularly those who had supported the original charges against Eleanor, viewed Alexander's continued courtship as a personal affront. Invitations to certain houses were rescinded. Old friends became distant. Alexander bore these social consequences with aristocratic indifference, but Eleanor felt the weight of what he sacrificed for her. One evening, as they walked through Westmere's gardens in the long twilight of early summer, Eleanor voiced her concerns. "You have lost friendships because of me," she said quietly. "People who welcomed you before now cut you in public. I see the letters that arrive, the invitations that do not. This is the cost of your association with me, Alexander." He stopped walking, turning to face her fully. "The cost of my association with you is that I must occasionally endure the disapproval of people whose opinions I never valued highly to begin with. The benefit of my association with you is that I wake each morning with purpose, that I go to sleep each night knowing I have lived according to my principles rather than others' expectations. Eleanor, do you truly not see? You have not diminished my life. You have enriched it beyond measure." "But what if you come to regret this choice?" Eleanor asked, voicing the fear that sometimes woke her in the dark hours before dawn. "What if, years from now, you look back and wish you had chosen differently?" Alexander took her hands in his blue eyes intense in the fading light. "I have only one regret about my choices regarding you, and that is that I waited 3 months to do this." He released her hands and, to Eleanor's shock, lowered himself to one knee on the garden path. "Eleanor Hartley, you are the most remarkable woman I have ever known. You are brave and intelligent and compassionate beyond reason. You saved my life, and in doing so, you gave me a reason to value that life. I am tired of courtship and propriety and waiting for society's approval that will never fully come. Marry me, Eleanor, not because it is expected or convenient, but because I love you with everything I am. Marry me and spend your life as my partner, my equal, my Duchess." Eleanor felt tears spilling down her cheeks as she looked at this powerful man kneeling before her, offering not just his name and position, but his whole heart. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, Alexander, I will marry you." He rose, pulling her into his arms and kissing her with a passion that propriety would have forbidden, but that felt entirely right in this moment. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Eleanor saw that they had acquired an audience. The Dowager Duchess stood on the terrace, along with Mrs. Henley and several other servants, all applauding with undisguised delight. "About time," the Dowager called out. "I was beginning to think I would die before seeing you properly wed, Alexander." The engagement was announced the following week, generating the expected mixture of congratulations and scandal. Some members of society viewed it as a romantic triumph, others as the Duke's incomprehensible descent into madness. But Eleanor found she cared less about society's opinion with each passing day. She had Alexander's love, meaningful work, and a future limited only by her own vision and courage. One particularly meaningful response came via letter from Caroline Fairchild, now living peacefully with her aunt in Yorkshire. The girl, who had found employment as a teacher in a small school, wrote expressing joy at the news and thanking Eleanor again for not condemning her alongside her parents. Eleanor wrote back immediately, assuring Caroline that she harboured no ill will and wishing her every happiness in her new life. The wedding was set for late summer, giving Eleanor time to complete the current term at the Institute, and Alexander time to prepare Westmere Manor for its new mistress. But 3 weeks before the ceremony, an unexpected visitor arrived at the Institute while Eleanor was teaching. The Bishop of London himself, accompanied by 2 other church officials, entered the classroom where Eleanor was demonstrating the proper harvesting and drying of medicinal herbs. Her students froze, clearly fearing some new accusation, some revival of old charges. But the bishop's expression was thoughtful rather than condemning. "Miss Hartley," he said after introducing himself, "I apologize for interrupting your work. Might I have a word in private?" Eleanor led him to the small office she maintained in the building, her heart pounding despite her outward calm. The last time church officials had taken interest in her work, it had ended with her tied to a stake. "Miss Hartley," the bishop began once they were alone, I have spent the past months reviewing the evidence presented at the assemblage regarding your case. I have consulted with medical experts, theologians, and scholars of natural philosophy. I have prayed extensively for guidance in this matter. Eleanor waited, barely breathing, for whatever judgment was to come. I am here to issue an official declaration on behalf of the Church, he continued. The original charges of witchcraft brought against you were not merely unjust. They were theologically unsound. Knowledge of healing herbs and plants is not witchcraft. It is, as one of the physicians who testified on your behalf argued, the application of understanding to God's creation. The Church erred gravely in allowing such charges to proceed, and we erred even more gravely in not intervening sooner to prevent your near execution. Eleanor felt lightheaded with relief and vindication. Your grace is most generous. I am not generous, I am correct, the bishop said firmly. And I am here to do more than simply apologize. The Church wishes to formally endorse your institute, Miss Hartley. We want to help expand your work, to train more women in these vital skills, to transform what has been unfairly dismissed as superstition into recognized medical practice. Healing the sick is God's work, regardless of whether it is performed by a university-trained physician or a woman who learned her craft from her grandmother. The bishop's endorsement changed everything. Within weeks, applications to the institute tripled. Women from across England sought training, and Eleanor found herself needing to expand both her facilities and her teaching staff. Dr. Crawford agreed to relocate from Edinburgh to serve as the institute's medical director, and 2 other physicians, impressed by Eleanor's work, offered their services as instructors. But the most significant change came in how Eleanor was perceived. No longer the controversial figure some whispered about in scandal, she became recognized as a pioneer in women's medical education. Scholars began citing her grandmother's journal in their papers. Medical societies invited her to present her findings. The woman who had nearly burned as a witch was becoming celebrated as an innovator. Through all of this transformation, Alexander remained her constant support and greatest advocate. He provided funding for the Institute's expansion, used his influence to secure formal recognition from medical authorities, and never once suggested that her work should be subordinated to her role as his Duchess. The morning of their wedding dawned clear and warm, the late summer sun painting Westmere Manor in shades of gold. Eleanor dressed in her mother's wedding gown, carefully preserved and altered to fit her frame. Mrs. Thornbury wept as she arranged Eleanor's hair, weaving flowers from the manor's gardens into the simple braided coronet. "Your mother would be so proud," the old woman said, her voice thick with emotion. "And your grandmother. They would see how you have taken their knowledge and transformed it into something that will help countless women for generations to come." The ceremony took place in Westmere's private chapel, a small stone building that had served the Graves family for 3 centuries. The guest list was carefully curated, including only those who had genuinely supported Eleanor during her ordeal, and those who could support them going forward. The Dowager Duchess sat in the front pew, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Dr. Bentley and Dr. Crawford attended, along with all of Eleanor's students from the Institute. Even young Peter Fletcher was there, the boy whose miraculous recovery had inadvertently triggered Eleanor's persecution, now healthy and strong. As Eleanor walked down the aisle on Mrs. Thornbury's arm, having no male relative to perform the duty, she felt the weight of all she had endured and overcome. She had faced death and survived. She had been condemned and vindicated. She had lost everything and gained more than she had ever imagined possible. And now, she was walking toward Alexander, who stood at the altar watching her approach with such love and pride in his eyes that she felt her own tears threatening to fall. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of familiar words and sacred promises. Eleanor heard herself speaking vows, felt Alexander sliding a ring onto her finger, and then the priest was pronouncing them man and wife, and Alexander was kissing her to the sound of applause echoing through the small chapel. At the wedding breakfast that followed, held in Westmere's grand ballroom, the Dowager Duchess rose to offer a toast. "To my grandson and his Duchess," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the assembled guests. "May their marriage be blessed with happiness purpose, and the courage to continue challenging conventions that deserve to be challenged. Eleanor, you have brought light and life to this family. We are better for your presence among us. As the guests raised their glasses, Eleanor looked around the room at the faces gathered to celebrate their union. She saw her students, who represented the future she was helping to build. She saw the physicians who had validated her knowledge and methods. She saw the servants of Westmere who had accepted her as their new mistress. And most of all, she saw Alexander, her husband, her partner, her love. That evening, as the last guests departed and they finally had a moment alone together, Alexander led Eleanor to the gardens where he had proposed. The summer flowers were in full bloom, filling the air with fragrance that reminded her of the healing herbs she had worked with all her life. "There is something I want to show you," Alexander said, guiding her along a path she had not yet explored. They walked in comfortable silence until they reached a small clearing where a new building stood, larger and more sophisticated than the one at Hartley House. "What is this?" Eleanor asked, though she already suspected. "A gift," Alexander replied. "A proper facility for your work, here at Westmere. Large enough to accommodate 50 students, with dormitories for those who travel from distant counties, laboratories equipped with the finest instruments from Europe, and a library dedicated to medical texts and botanical research. I thought perhaps we might make this the permanent home of the Hartley Institute." Eleanor stared at the building, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was offering. Not just resources, but validation. Not just support, but partnership. Not just acceptance, but celebration of who she was and what she could accomplish. "The Hartley Graves Institute," she said softly. "If we are partners in this marriage, we should be partners in this work as well." Alexander smiled, that beautiful smile she had learned to treasure. "The Hartley Graves Institute," he agreed. "I like that very much." As they stood together in the garden, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had been condemned as a witch, saved from flames, vindicated before society, and now stood as the Duchess of Westmere, with the power and resources to transform women's medical education throughout England. The same knowledge that had nearly cost her life would now save countless others. "What are you thinking?" Alexander asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "That sometimes," Eleanor replied, leaning back against him. "The worst moments of our lives lead us to the best destinations. If I had not been arrested, if you had not saved me, if we had not fought together for truth and justice, none of this would exist. The Institute, our marriage, the changes we are beginning to make in how women's knowledge is valued and preserved. Suffering should not be required for growth," Alexander observed. "You should not have had to nearly die to achieve recognition." "No," Eleanor agreed, "but since suffering came anyway, I choose to extract meaning and purpose from it. I choose to ensure that other women will not face what I faced, that their knowledge will be celebrated rather than condemned, that healing will be recognized as the sacred work it is, regardless of who performs it." Alexander tightened his embrace. "Then we will build that future together, Your Grace, as partners, as equals, as two people who refuse to accept that the world must remain as it has always been." Eleanor turned in his arms, reaching up to cup his face in her hands. "I love you, Alexander Graves. Thank you for seeing me when the world demanded I be invisible. Thank you for valuing what others condemned. Thank you for being exactly the man I needed, precisely when I needed him most." I love you, Eleanor," he replied, "and I promise you this. We will spend our lives proving that love and purpose, passion and principle can coexist in a marriage built on mutual respect and shared vision. You will never have to choose between being my wife and being yourself. You will always be both, fully and completely." As they kissed in the garden, surrounded by flowers and possibility, Eleanor felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. She had found her place in the world, not despite who she was, but because of it. She had found a partner who celebrated her strength rather than fearing it. She had found purpose that would extend far beyond her own life, touching countless women who would learn and heal and teach others in turn. The woman who had once knelt in her humble garden, harvesting herbs to pay her father's debts, was now a duchess, with the power to reshape society's understanding of women's knowledge and capabilities. And she would use that power well, honoring the generations of healers who had come before her and paving the way for those who would follow. Some truths, Eleanor had learned, are indeed written in fire. But from the ashes of that fire, new life could grow, stronger and more beautiful than anything that had existed before. She had nearly burned, but she had survived. And in surviving, she had found not just love, but purpose, legacy, and the profound satisfaction of knowing her life would make the world better for countless others. That was worth any trial, any suffering, any moment of terror she had endured. That was, in the end, what transformed a tragedy into a triumph and a victim into a victor.